our next speaker. I'm just going to flip the right page. They're stuck together, connected. Our next speaker is Ewa Westermark. She works as an architect and an urban planner at Gehl in Copenhagen. She focuses on the built environment and the effect it has social interactions between people. She's here to talk about how public space can stimulate interaction and connections between people in cities. So a very warm welcome to Ewa Westermark.
Thank you. So, yes, I will talk about social connections and space, because space changes our behavior or affect our behavior. And just this space has already changed my behavior. When Martin told me that we were going to be here, gave me a challenge of not having the slideshow. And I've never done that. So I felt a bit uncomfortable, but also realized that this space actually requires a different type of behavior. So instead, I made this little hymn book of connections. And I'm going to spare you from singing. I also, to honor this theme, you don't have one each of you, but you have to share. So the first hymn I've called Ode to Staying, because as you said, Martin, it's not about the numbers. And we have a desire, of course, to create meeting places in our cities that can create social connections. But we focus a lot about number of people. And what we actually should do is focus on places that makes you stay and stop. So as an example, I have these two spaces in Copenhagen. Very different spaces, but they have one thing in common, is that they have the same amount of people or pedestrians in them, 8,000 pedestrians a day. But one space in Ørestad, some of you know it, it's a quick rush between the metro or train into fields or wherever you're going. There's very little staying. And the other space, with the same amount of pedestrians, Stradet, the side street of Strøget in Copenhagen, invites people to stay and stop. And this is really about quality, and this is where you have the opportunity to meet other people in a completely different way. And we know that if we can get people to stay, more people will come, because people attract people. And that's really the core thing about public space. It's actually the people inside them. So the second hymn I call Praise to the Edge. We might think we want to be in the center of things in order to meet other people, but when it comes to space, it's actually on the edge where things happen. And I think you all know that you would never stand in the middle of the room or in the middle of a space. You feel pretty insecure. You always sort of lean up against the walls, the intersection between the buildings and the space. This is where you feel protected. This is usually where microclimate is good. You can find shelter. You can actually, if you have a really good edge, you can be alone but still be with other people. So it's usually on the edge where it happens. And a good way to kill a place is create really bad edges, not inviting people to stay. And we can see this in a lot of our research. And this is not about putting cafes all over our cities. I think we can't drink more cafe latte as it is now. It's true also in housing areas. If you provide a really soft and nice edge to your home with a front garden, that's where we see where most activities happen. That's where people stay long. And it's also perfect. You know, you sit in your private space, you feel very protected, and you see your neighbor coming by that you don't want to meet. You can just like lean down and become invisible. But if you really want to connect, you can move forward and you can start a conversation, and if time is right, you can actually invite them for coffee. So it's this transition from the very private and protected into the more public that we want to create. So stay on the edge. The third hymn I called Honor the Everyday. Because one thing we do when we want to create meeting places in cities is that we focus a lot on destination spaces, like the main square. And they are important, but we see so many of our everyday spaces neglected in terms of quality of space. I used an example to illustrate this small city or town in Denmark called Haslev, which has the same amount of yearly visitors, this supermarket Netto, as Louisiana has, which is the 10th most visited attraction in all of Denmark. And of course it's different. One is reoccurring visitors, one is unique visitors. But still, just think of it, how neglected that everyday space is. And this is where we spend most of our time. And I think this is one of our most underutilized potential of creating more social connection, also inviting people to stay in our everyday spaces. So an ode to everyday spaces. The fourth hymn I've called Tribute to Shared Experiences. And I think that you all know this bridging and bonding, and I really liked Nancy's way of saying it's my people. So bonding is really where you connect to people that are similar to yourself in one way or another. You form stronger connections. But bridging is actually forming connections with people that are different from yourself. And we need spaces that can do both. And we need a balance of the two. But it's interesting to see what is it that would make you actually connect to someone that is different from yourself. And shared experiences, if we can provide shared experiences, and I think the idea of watching music together, it's a very strong shared experience. And if we can create these experiences not only where we like the same music, but we actually encounter a shared experience liking different things. And that could also be something like these guys interacting around this octagonal, yes? Ping pong table at Market Street in San Francisco, which was one of 50 prototypes that was built over 3 days, that was placed in the street over 3 days of a time in San Francisco. And it was a project we worked on in order to try to transform a transport corridor where people were moving only from A to B, and actually helping them to stop, helping them to give them a reason to interact. Another example was the musical bench, where you had to hold hands and sit down, and then the music actually started. So just giving people help to create shared experiences and help to connect to someone that is not like you. So the fifth and the last hymn I call Celebrate What You Care About. I used an example from a project that I worked on in New York. And when we started this 2008, the city actually didn't really know much about the people in the spaces. They had tons of information about cars and traffic. They didn't know how many people actually spent time or walked in a place like Times Square. So we did, with fairly simple investigations, we could just tell that 90% of the users of this space are pedestrians. 10% are in cars, but the space allocated was the difference. So these 90% were crowding in 10% of space. And the project itself was this temporary transformation, temporary project on Broadway. I called it Roll Out the Red Carpet for Everyone, not only for celebrities. And it was temporary. That was sort of the key to why it happened. And also a way to honor that we don't always have the right answer. So saying that we want to make a good space where people connect, we will try this, and we can investigate and talk to people how they experience this, and we can observe if things actually happen the way we wished, if people do meet, if people do stop. And in this case, there were a lot of positive impact. It became safer. You could see much more diverse user groups. Kids came. A completely new user group, which was the locals, came back to Times Square. They'd been sort of pushed out from all the tourists. But they wasn't perfect by any means. There was also conflicts between pedestrians and bicyclists, and because it was temporary, it could be reiterated many times. So for several years, it tested different types of solution until it became a permanent place that was designed by Snöhetta. But after this, I mean, Broadway, it was sort of the flagship project. A lot of people have heard about it. But where the real impact happened was when Department of Transportation created this Plaza program. It's called New York City Plaza Program. So since the Broadway pilot, almost 70 new public spaces have been created all over the city, in the neighborhoods, in the outer boroughs. And the city, New York City, they kept on measuring, the economic impact. They looked at safety measures, but they didn't know what was the actual social impact of these spaces. So we got the chance to investigate some of these, both on Manhattan, but also in the other boroughs, where we could go a little bit deeper, and we could ask questions about how these new spaces had actually changed people's behavior. And also look at more than just age and gender, who was spending time, but what was their social economic background? Where did they come from? Were they locals? Were they tourists? And not to say that we have any specific answers, but it was quite interesting to see how different these spaces functioned, whether they were on Manhattan or more locally in the other boroughs. And a lot of people reported that they spent more time outside after the public space came into the place. They also reported back that they recognized and knew more people in their neighborhood because they spent more time, they saw more people. And to us, it was also surprisingly many that felt connected to the space or felt ownership of the space. Because not a lot of these people were actually part of the process of designing it or part of a process of deciding that it should be or what it should look like. But a lot of people felt connected because it was local. And it was one part that I think had a strong effect was that if the city was the one providing the physical infrastructure, it was local organizations and NGOs that operated them, maintained them, and created all the events, etc. So as a final note, I think as an urban planner, if you say connections, you have an image of a street, of a physical connection or something like that. But these physical connections, they hold really, really tight hands with the social connections. In good times and bad times, we see a lot of physical connections that become barriers, dividing neighborhoods, poor and rich. But if we make these physical connections, whether that's streets or parks or squares, really, really focused on inviting people to spend time, to walk and stay, they also reinforce the social connections. When I was in New Orleans, I learned that they have a special name for the center of the street, like the median, we call it. They call it neutral ground. And it comes from a historic event when along Canal Street, which divided two rivalry neighborhoods, the French and the American, they actually met in the middle to resolve their conflicts. And this is where I get extremely passionate about true public space, that it's not only about the positive social connection, it's also about the possibilities of really resolving conflict. So everything from that end to kissing your lover, that's what public spaces can do. Thank you.